In the year 1890, the Nile River moved through the heart of Africa carrying something that Europeans had never learned to fear properly. A crocodile could lie motionless in water for 45 minutes, then explode into movement faster than a horse at full gallop. Biologists who studied the species in the early 20th century estimated that a single adult female could produce 40 to 60 eggs in a single season. Do the math across a river system that stretches over 6,000 kilometers, and you have an animal that, left alone, fills every ecological slot available to it with a kind of industrial efficiency that no human operation has ever truly replicated. And then we tried anyway. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of what happens when one of Africa's most dangerous and most ecologically essential predators becomes the raw material for a luxury goods industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and what that relationship, brutal and complicated as it is, has done to the survival of the species itself. Because here's the thing that most people get completely wrong when they hear the words crocodile farm. They assume it's a story of exploitation pushing a species toward collapse. And for a long time, in some places it was, but in southern Africa, particularly across Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Zambia, something else happened. Something that conservation biologists are still arguing about today, because the data doesn't fit the easy narrative. The Nile crocodile, Crocodilus niloticus, was commercially hunted to near-functional extinction across much of its range between the 1940s and the 1970s. Not the dramatic, visible collapse of an elephant population, but a slow hollowing out. The hunters came from Europe and from local commercial operations with small boats and high-powered rifles and spotlights that caught the reflective eyes at the surface in the dark. A single crocodile skin, properly processed, could command prices that made the risk worthwhile, and the risk was almost entirely on the crocodile. By the late 1960s, wildlife surveys along stretches of the Zambezi River that had once recorded hundreds of animals per kilometer were coming back with counts in the single digits. The Nile crocodile was, in the language of wildlife management, commercially extinct in large portions of its historic range, not biologically gone, but functionally removed from the ecosystem. And what followed that removal demonstrated something that ecologists now regard as foundational. When you take the apex predator out of a river system, the river begins to reorganize itself around that absence, and almost none of the changes are improvements. Certain fish populations exploded without the predation pressure that crocodiles had maintained for millions of years. Nesting water birds, which had co-evolved with crocodiles in a relationship more protective than predatory crocodiles, driving off monitor lizards and other egg thieves from the shoreline, found their nests collapsing at higher rates. The river margins themselves, kept open by the regular movement of large reptile bodies, became dense with vegetation that changed water flow patterns. None of it catastrophic in isolation, all of it adding up to an ecosystem running on a different and diminished logic. But here is where the conventional story turns. In Zimbabwe, a government wildlife authority called Campfire, the Communal Areas Management Program for Indigenous Resources, began in the 1980s to formalize what had been an informal and frequently illegal relationship between rural communities and crocodile eggs. Communities had been harvesting crocodile nests for generations, using the eggs partly for food and partly for trade. The formal system converted that harvest into a ranching model. Collect eggs from wild nests, incubate them under controlled conditions, raise juveniles to marketable size, and process them for skins and meat. A portion of the animals, typically around 15%, would be returned to the wild to support the breeding population. That 15% figure is not arbitrary. It became the operational standard for what the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, would recognize as a sustainable ranching protocol for crocodilians, and it was based on a hard ecological reality. Nile crocodile hatchling survival in the wild is extraordinarily low. Estimates from long-term monitoring programs suggest that fewer than 1 in 100 eggs laid in a natural nest will produce an animal that survives to its second year. Predation of nests, flooding, temperature extremes, predation of hatchlings by monitor lizards, fish, birds, and other crocodiles, the attrition is relentless. A ranching operation that collects eggs, incubates them at controlled temperatures, feeds the hatchlings protein-rich diets, and protects them through their most vulnerable months can achieve survival rates above 90% to the point of harvest. The arithmetic changes what the practice means ecologically. If a farming operation collects 1,000 eggs from wild nests in a given season and returns 150 animals to the wild at a size large enough to survive most predators, it has effectively increased the recruitment of juvenile crocodiles into the wild population by a factor of roughly 15 compared to what would have occurred if those eggs had been left in place. The farming operation is not just extracting from the wild population. Under the regulated model, it is functioning as an amplifier. The Nile crocodile industry in southern Africa today operates at a scale that most people outside of it would find genuinely difficult to imagine. South Africa's Nile crocodile farming sector, centered largely in Limpopo province, produces hundreds of thousands of hides annually, destined primarily for the European and Asian luxury goods markets. A single large-scale operation might hold anywhere from 10,000 to 60,000 animals at various stages of growth. The skins of juvenile crocodiles, which have smoother belly scales without the osteoderms, the bony deposits that make the hides of larger animals less workable, are the premium product. A finished Nile crocodile skin of sufficient quality sells wholesale for prices that place it among the most expensive leather materials in the world. The meat enters a separate market. Crocodile meat is consumed locally across much of sub-Saharan Africa, where it has been a traditional food source for centuries. It also exports to specialty markets in Europe, Asia, and Australia, where it is positioned as a lean, high-protein alternative to conventional meats. A well-managed farm wastes almost nothing. The skull and bones move into the tourist curio market, the fat has cosmetic applications, and the cartilage has found a place in nutritional supplement production. And then there is the layer of this story that most people never reach. In 2012, a team of researchers published findings in the journal PLOS ONE that documented something in Nile crocodile social behavior that had gone largely unobserved until someone put a camera on a free-ranging population long enough to see it properly. Nile crocodiles, the study found, engage in cooperative herding behavior when hunting fish. Groups of animals, sometimes numbering a dozen or more, position themselves in coordinated arcs in the water, driving schools of fish into progressively tighter formations where individual crocodiles can feed efficiently. The behavior appears to be socially learned, passed between animals over time, and it requires a minimum population density to function. Below a certain threshold of animals per kilometer of river, the behavior breaks down. The individuals are still present. The knowledge, the accumulated behavioral pattern, this is the thing that the ranching model cannot replace. You can return 15% of your hatchlings to the wild. You can hit the population numbers that the surveys require. But a juvenile crocodile released at 18 months into a river system where the population has been depleted for 30 years is not returning to a functioning crocodile society. It is entering a habitat where the behavioral library that makes the species fully operational as an ecological force has been interrupted. The animal has the instinct. It does not have the context in which that instinct becomes a skill. It is the same problem that emerges whenever we try to reassemble something we have taken apart. The parts can go back in, but the accumulated pattern of how they work together does not automatically reconstitute itself. And this is precisely why conservationists who work with crocodilians argue that the farming model, while genuinely contributing to population maintenance in many areas, cannot substitute for the protection and restoration of wild populations dense enough to sustain their own behavioral complexity. The Nile crocodile is today listed as least concern on the IUCN Red List. That is a result of decades of work, including the regulated farming and ranching systems, wildlife protection enforcement, and changes in international trade law following the near collapse of populations in the 1960s and 1970s. But least concern is an aggregate category. Within it, there are river systems where the population has genuinely recovered, where you can run a boat along the Zambezi at dawn and count animals on every bank. And there are systems where the numbers are technically adequate and the ecological function is still absent, where the crocodile is present but not yet restored. In Botswana's Okavango Delta, where commercial hunting pressure was lower and the regulatory environment tightened earlier, long-term monitoring by researchers working with the Botswana Predator Conservation Trust has documented population structures and behavioral patterns consistent with a functionally intact crocodile community. The animals there exhibit the full range of behaviors, the cooperative hunting, the nest guarding patterns, the hierarchical social structuring around permanent territories that characterize a population that has been continuous long enough to retain its cultural knowledge. In areas where the population was commercially extinct and has been rebuilt through ranching and release programs, that behavioral richness is still reassembling, slowly, over generations. Because the crocodile is a long-lived animal, females in the wild can exceed 50 years. The generational transmission of learned behavior is measured in decades, not years. A population that was functionally collapsed in 1970 and began recovering in 1985 is in 2025, only 2 or 3 crocodile generations into the process of remembering how to be fully itself. There is an old word in the Shona language of Zimbabwe, Angwenya, that means crocodile. It also carries the weight of something older and more dangerous than what the English word suggests. It is a word that implies not just an animal, but a presence, a force in the water that reorganizes everything around it. For generations during the commercial hunting era, the rivers where Ngwenya had been the defining presence became rivers where the word had no referent. The name survived the absence. And now, in the river systems where the recovery is furthest along, the word is beginning to describe something real again. What the crocodile farming industry built, at its best, was a bridge. Not a perfect one, not one without costs or contradictions. The conditions inside large-scale commercial operations are a legitimate subject of scrutiny, and the degree to which CITES regulations are uniformly enforced across the entire industry is a question that wildlife trade monitors continue to raise. But the core relationship, a commercially viable use of wild-sourced eggs, operating under population monitoring frameworks, returning animals to wild systems that those same farms help protect from poaching because they have economic value, has demonstrably contributed to the Nile crocodile not following the trajectory that its near collapse in the 1970s suggested it was on. It is an uncomfortable story for people who prefer their conservation narratives clean. The Nile crocodile is not saved by a passionate individual releasing animals from captivity into a pristine wilderness. It is partly maintained by an industry that processes its skin into handbags and its meat into restaurant menus, operating under a regulatory structure that links commercial viability to population health. The industry has every incentive to ensure the wild population remains robust, because the wild population is its raw material. And that incentive, mercenary as it sounds, has done measurable conservation work in parts of Africa where purely altruistic models had limited reach. The 3 questions that this leaves open, and that I think are worth sitting with, are these. First, at what population density does a Nile crocodile community become behaviorally functional again, not just numerically present? The research on cooperative hunting behavior suggests a threshold exists but defining it precisely for the purpose of management targets requires long-term field studies that are expensive and slow. Second, how do you build a regulatory system for a luxury goods industry operating across multiple nations with very different enforcement capacities and ensure that the sustainability credentials attached to the product at the point of sale reflect actual conditions on the river 3,000 kilometers away? CITES provides a framework. Whether that framework is adequately resourced is a different question. Third, what does it mean for an animal to be ecologically restored versus merely present? The Nile crocodile in the stretches of the Zambezi where it is recovering is not yet the same ecological force it was before commercial hunting. It is on its way to becoming that, but the process cannot be rushed and it cannot be manufactured. The behavioral library rebuilds itself generation by generation in animals that have enough undisturbed time and enough company to learn from. We did not restore the Nile crocodile. We stopped destroying it fast enough to let it begin the work of restoring itself. And we built, in some places, an economic structure that gave the humans living alongside it a reason to want the work to succeed. That is not a romantic story, but it is a real one, and real is what it needed to be. If you've spent time along an African river, or if you've ever thought about where the line is between using nature and restoring it, I want to hear where you think that line falls. Leave it in the comments because this question doesn't have a clean answer, and I genuinely think the people watching this have thought about it more carefully than most. Share this one if you know someone who's caught between hope and cynicism about conservation. This story is exactly the kind of thing that complicates the cynicism in the best possible way. There are more stories like this one than you'd ever imagine, and I have many more to tell you. I'm Tom Marsh. Thank you for watching.